Okay, we can go ahead and get started, even though we know people are just going to keep on hopping on, which is completely fine. So today we have Derek Wales. He's going to be chatting with us about his time at MIDS. He's going to give us a scoop about what he's been up to since graduation, and he's going to be available to answer any questions you all have about internships, jobs, courses, anything you can think of that you have a question about. Please take the time to ask Derek. So Derek, let's go ahead and you can start your presentation.
Okay, well, it's good to see everybody again, especially the old midsters, and thank you, Courtney. As Courtney mentioned, I'm happy to talk to you, and this is open to anything, but it's mostly going to be geared towards finding a job or internship, probably a little bit more geared towards the first years because it will cover both. But this is kind of meant to give you a little bit more granular perspective than some of the recruiters have gone through. They've kind of given you an overarching, like, this is what we want. This is meant to be like, okay, this is what you can kind of expect. Especially moving into October, this is kind of a good time to go over this. With that, I can see the chat, and I can see if you raise your hands, or at least I could when we tested earlier. So hand raise is preferred. If not, you can put something in the chat, and I'm going to try and stop every slide or periodically to kind of let students ask questions. And if we get a little off topic, that's okay. All right. So moving on, this is a quick agenda. Unfortunately, I do have to give you some bad news. But the good news is there's good news after the bad news, and it will all work out based upon students, several hundred students or over 100 students experience through the MIDS program. Okay. So moving on, as Courtney mentioned, I am a MIDS graduate. So I went to West Point, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's our military academy for the Army in the United States. And then I actually spent the next 10 years in the Army, and including getting assigned here while I was still in the Army. And for those of you who know the first year or second year, Chris, he's kind of a similar assignment situation to me. Unfortunately, I had a medical issue, and that prevented me from going back. And I transitioned out, worked briefly for a defense contractor, then actually the United States Postal Service. And then after that, I started a month ago tomorrow, I work at Dell Technologies as a product manager. So pretty good breadth of experience, and I went through a lot of the same thing you guys did. I'm also what you kind of call a well-lopsided candidate. I have a lot of particular knowledge in one industry, like government defense, but not like well-rounded. And actually, one of the great things about data science is you can use it in almost any field. So that is definitely the case for a lot of you who've worked in healthcare or something like that before. And I'm actually going to kind of show you that in some ways that can be an advantage. All right. So unfortunately, here is the bad news. Finding an internship is a long and difficult process, and you're going to get rejected at least somewhere. You're going to have to deal with that. You're going to need to learn some resiliency, and it sometimes takes a while. The employers are on their own timeline, not on yours. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind as you're going through this. And you guys, as we start to get into more of the topics here, please feel free to answer any questions. Or ask any questions. I kind of plan to answer questions as we're going throughout this. But the good news is we have a very high employment rate at the end of the program. So even though the process is difficult, you'll get there eventually. And there are a lot of things you can do to make it easier for yourself. So this first slide is going to be more geared towards the first years who are looking to find an internship. And actually, this is a good time to have this brief, because I'd recommend starting in October. Online can be frustrating, and it's easy to just fire things away online. But honestly, that's really not that effective. You're just a number. They may or may not even get through your pool. I've gotten rejection letters months after applying, barely even know any of the information about where you're at in the process. And then, the position is closed. Never even heard anything about from submitted to rejected. Didn't hear anything in between. There's also a lot of things you can do, plan based upon your interest and what's kind of likely. If you have less experience, now internships are generally for graduate students, but there are ones that are maybe less competitive and there are ones that are maybe more competitive. And this is kind of relates to what I talked about being well lopsided. So if you have a lot of knowledge in one particular area and you're passionate about it, that's going to come out when you talk to the recruiters. And there are a lot of things you can do, like find Duke alumni who work there or another MIDS alumni if you're really lucky. And all of that will make it more likely that your resume gets in front of the right person. Also with that, you got to have a methodology. So this is a screen cap of something I used while I was looking for an internship. I'm sure there's better products out there, but I had like by company, when I applied, like what the status was, link to check on that application, how interested I was, and then there was notes, the follow-up date, because at a certain point, it's gonna get overwhelming. And as you can see, this is just a screen cap capturing the top of the screen. There is a lot more that I applied to other than this. And actually the one I ended up interning for isn't even on here. So that should kind of give you some perspective, is you got to be persistent. And unfortunately, you're going to get a lot of bad news. And if you have 20, 30 applications that are in varying spots of the pipeline and you're following up with recruiters, you could be in a situation, if you don't track it, you don't even know who's reaching out to you. So if someone responds and it's like, hey, we need you to get you back. And it's like, oh, I forgot who Katie was, or I forgot who Courtney was, and they work for this company. So have it early and then continually update it, and it will make your life a lot easier as you search for your job. Kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but personal connections do make you stand out. So I actually got my internship through this is 2019, before a lot of the lockdowns. And I went to something at the engineering, it was a Pratt internship / job fair. And I happened to notice one of the guys was in the Army, and then struck up a conversation with him, then reached out directly to him. And then that's the internship kind of came from that. So we had something in common. I noticed that there's 100 different ways that can be kind of applied to you guys. Okay. Same thing with my current job. I got it working at Dell through a Duke alumni. And then one of the best resources is actually each other. I see AB is on the phone. Abhishek, a guy who graduated with me, him and another student, we prepared for internships, or excuse me, interviews together. So we practiced a lot of the basic questions, and that actually paid big dividends when I did get interviewed, excuse me. The biggest recommendation I can have for being prepared for those interviews is to be kind of brilliant at the basics. So you want to have short, succinct answers to a lot of common questions. An example I can think of is one job I ended up getting an offer for, ended up not taking it, at an engineering company. The most difficult thing, the three things that kind of jump out from that interview, I had to do a presentation on an academic project. It was a data science role supporting actually the Department of the Navy. And they asked me CDFs, which is like cumulative distribution function, or about variance, and then some basic ML concepts. They're not going to ask you to go really in depth. And if you have a really long answer and you're talking to a pretty seasoned person, especially as with the stress of the interview, and the odds that you forget something go up a lot. So if you have short, succinct answers that you kind of practice amongst your peers, it's just going to come out, and that's going to project confidence. All right. Is there any questions or anything related to looking for an internship kind of specifically before I move on here? All right, looks like nothing heard. Let me just check the chat, and it doesn't look like it. All right, so kind of moving on here. One sec. Just make your participation window a bit bigger here. So moving on to the job search. The easiest way to get a job is to convert your internship, right? And then as soon as you come back, going into your second year of mids with all those electives, et cetera, then that's one less thing you got to worry about. Good news is the job search is easier, I've found, than getting an internship. There's more jobs, there's a shortage of data scientists, et cetera. But it can be more stressful because it's the real deal. You don't have that backstop of, well, there's next year. So a lot of that start early, network, personal connections, all that stuff is equally true when you go through the job search process. And also be sure to, this really goes for the internships as well, but be sure to have a good presentation of your work. Like I would shoot to have something coming into second semester of like your GitHub website, maybe even a cert. I remember there was one, there's actually a job offer, not an internship. The guy called me and he was confused by the organization of my GitHub. He's like, hey, I couldn't find any natural language processing related stuff on your GitHub. And I went back and I was like, if it wasn't me looking through this and knowing where I put everything, I would be confused too. And needless to say, I torpedoed that opportunity. So employers are only going to dig deeper if something looks askew. But if it's well organized, there's clear, high quality projects. They don't have time to go through every single applicant's with a fine tooth comb, but if they can look at it, see that this guy's organized, he's got a good grasp of the basics, that's going to put you to the top of the line, if that makes sense. Also certs, I know I'm kind of sounding like Noah here and a broken record, but a lot of the recruiters will filter based upon certain certifications. So having them on your LinkedIn, having them current is another thing to make you to kind of distinguish yourself. And then also searching for a job is roughly the equivalent of having a pretty demanding class. So I'll show you a screenshot here. This is my calendar from December of last year. I've kind of blanked out some of the personal details, some of it's fitness related, and then some of it, I'm going to circle them real quick. Those are all work or internship related events. And then with that, if you're talking to Rob Pritchard at Data Talent, there's some implied tasks there too. Like, oh, who's Rob? Like, who are some of his clients? And you got to have some working knowledge of who you're going to speak to before that incident happens. So you can see rapidly, if you've applied to 5, 10 jobs, each one of those probably has 2 to 3 interviews at least to get an offer, and then you got to negotiate the offer, and then you want to line those things up so you can negotiate offers against one another. That rapidly starts to become like having a very difficult class in terms of the amount of time you spend. Was there a question? I guess not. Okay, moving on. One note is I actually had one class and then a mini class going into my final semester at mids because of this reason, as I was transitioning out of the military, and it made a huge difference in the job search process. Obviously, if you've converted your internship, you show up the second, there's a lot less stress going into that second year, but it is just kind of something to be mindful of. All right, no questions on this? All right, moving on. So keys to success, and this is the last one, then we'll kind of open it up for questions, not specific to anything about the MIDS program or anything you guys want to ask me. One of the first things I'd mention to you is don't get discouraged. You're going to have setbacks, but there's been about 100 students who've graduated through this program and went through the same thing that you're going through, and also you have each other. So that's going to be one of your greatest resources. Network. Again, probably sounds a lot like the career coach, but it does work. My my job I got, or excuse me, my internship that I worked for part-time was because the guy and I had both been in the Army. And my current job I was referred directly by a Duke alum. So there is some tangible results related to the network I'd built while I was at MIDS. Be organized and start early, right? This is a lot. You want to be a data scientist. The earlier you start and the earlier you find your job, the sooner you're going to be on that career path. I mean, a lot of this stuff is not that difficult if you do it over time. So if you're practicing for an internship or an interview or something like that, and you've done it a little bit every day with your buddies, that's a lot less stress than I have a week to finish this Amazon technical assessment, and then they're going to interview me that I haven't prepared for. So I got a question from Jay. Is it good practice to personally write to HR or handshake on any job potential portal after we apply for the internship? I'd say it depends. So, for example, if you have LinkedIn Premium, and a lot of times, if you look at a job description with LinkedIn Premium, they will give you the hiring point of contact. In a situation like that, I would absolutely reach out to them. I would apply and then immediately reach out to them and say, hey, just want to let you know, here's my resume. And then with any luck, they'll go right to your resume, and then at least it gets in front of the right people, if that makes sense. Start early, stay organized, never too early to start. Professional website and GitHub. As I kind of mentioned, I kind of learned that one the hard way when I didn't even think about it. I thought it was entirely academic. And then a potential employer asked me like, hey, I can't find this on your GitHub. And I was like, oh, well, too late to organize it. And then I didn't get that opportunity. That's kind of obvious to say. As I mentioned before, AB and I, a peer of mine and several other students practice with each other, reviewing each other's resumes and all that stuff. It actually can be a little fun, as much as it would seem not to be. At least you're building some camaraderie, and that's actually one of the best resources for getting ready for a lot of these internships, interviews, and whether it's for a internship or a job interview. And then if you convert your internship, that's one less thing you got to worry about going into your second year. So that is a huge weight off your shoulders, a lot less stress on you guys that you don't have to think about moving forward. All right, that's really all I had prepared. Are there any kind of specific questions or anything related to what you guys have experienced or anything along those lines? Okay. I hope you'll we'll pause for a minute here, and if nothing jumps out, I'll stay on a few minutes after. If nobody wants to ask a question in front of everybody, I'll hang out for a few minutes. And then I'll release you back to the mid staff, I guess.
Hey, Derek, can you tell people, I know you've only been in your current position for just a short period of time, but I think people are always curious what it's like to be like a quote unquote real data scientist. Like, can you go over what a typical day is like, what your projects are like, how you work with your coworkers?
Sure. So in my case, I briefly worked for a defense contractor part-time, and this is a long answer to a short question. And then I worked for the post office full-time for about 6 months. And those data skills and data literacy were actually very helpful in my current job. I actually have a business role, but they hired me because of the skills I learned in the MIDS program. So I'm what's called a product manager. For Dell sells a lot of servers in addition to computers. But because I had experience with the cloud, they offered me a lot of my skills were related to the position. So I think most of the problems I was asked to solve, one of the first things you can do, this is data science related or my current job related, is really you kind of want to understand the business case or the use case. So you can spin your wheels and do something very difficult or try and do the most sophisticated machine learning solution to something. But honestly, most of the answers, or a healthy percentage of them, can be answered with pretty straightforward techniques if you're answering the right question and you know what your data represents, if that makes sense. So you don't want to go on some wild goose chase trying to do the most sophisticated thing you can. It's much better to get something out that answers the mail 80% of the for 80% of the problems and then work to refine it if you get it out quickly, as opposed to drawing something out over an extended period of time. And then communicate it well, and when it can be used and what it can't be used for, that will pay big dividends. And then as for the day in, day out of my current job, because of my background, I've kind of defaulted as the, hey, we need to run down this particular thing. Like, what's our margin per unit when we sell to this client? And a lot of the skills I learned in mids, kind of understanding how databases work, et cetera, and some of the software we learned, I can answer that a lot more quickly. Or actually, the MBA students can't even, they can't. It's like not within their ability to answer those type of questions.
Yo, D-Money, so question, my man. What classes do you recommend that the students take that like would prepare you for your job, or like what classes would actually be of use in the real world?
So actually the best and actually probably the most difficult class I took for preparing me for technical internships was, it used to be Stat 611. They didn't offer it, so they put us in like an undergrad, second semester probability course. And that was like my baseline for answering any interview question. In terms of what I use day in, day out, it's actually a lot of visualizations with Power BI. So a little bit of Jana's class from first semester, a lot of those principles, and Noah's class in terms of the applied, because that's where I was short on. I hadn't used a lot of these technologies in the applied settings. So doing all those, like, this is how you do this with AWS, this is how you do this with GCP, actually have paid big dividends at my current job and previous jobs. Tomorrow, I'm actually going to be showing a lot of my coworkers, because I'm on the server side, and Dell also makes a cloud, like it's only for people who've bought our servers and enterprise client, but we actually have something kind of similar to AWS. And I'm going to be showing all my coworkers, like, hey, this is what AWS offers. This is why, like, we're losing some customers to them, et cetera. Here's their capabilities. It blah, 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 blah. So I'd say both of those. So I'd say understanding basic stats and probability, the next class to kind of learn the fundamentals of data science, and then Noah's class for a lot of the cloud computing stuff that I use pretty much day in, day out at my current job. All right. Well, if nobody else, Courtney, do you have anything? Oh. You offer any advice on how to get started? Are there? Okay, so Goodwin, I'll answer Goodwin's question, and then Courtney's. Are there skills you had to learn on the job? A lot of it for me is domain knowledge. So I didn't know why price per unit or margin per unit or total revenue per unit, like how those related to specifically what I was doing and when we used what, or a lot of the different commodity related configurations and how basically we modeled costs to pass it off to the customer, because I am on basically the overarching product side for several of the servers. So a lot of it was domain knowledge. And then I think a lot of students, there are things I kind of learned from the Army about when you deal with someone who is higher up in the company than you, like the type of questions you want to ask. You want to ask questions that are appropriate to their position. You kind of want to ask things that are, you don't want to ask them like day in, day out questions of how to do something. And then also there's some general habits. So for example, Michael Dell just published a book. I immediately bought it and I'm going to read it within the next 2 weeks, because that's kind of how your higher echelon is going to speak. They're going to speak in terms of your CEO. They're going to speak in terms of long-term strategy, et cetera. So a little bit of awareness of what your boss's perspectives are. I knew that was important for my previous job, but I would say that's kind of one of the biggest things I noticed from the MIDS program, and especially younger students. You gotta convert what you're doing into how it helps your boss. People who are successful are people who make their bosses successful, if that makes sense. And then I got a lot of hands-on experience with Power BI. I kind of knew how to use it, but now I pretty much use it every day. Okay. And I see a couple more questions kind of popping in. Up to you, Courtney. I can just stay on and answer the students' questions and then kind of give them back some time for those who don't. And or we can just kind of keep going how we're going.
I think it's good just to keep going as questions pop up. I think there are questions that other people probably have. So let's just continue, and I think it's good.
Okay, so hold on. Let me go up to Courtney's question here. Sorry. Struggling with the chat box. My apologies. You talked about the importance of networking. How can you offer advice on how to get started? So, for example, there are ways you can kind of make yourself stand out. Let's take this talk. Those of you who kind of ask questions or you send a thoughtful response to me after, and it includes some of the context, you're much more likely to convert that to a LinkedIn connection or something along those lines. If you just kind of, nobody likes to get random requests or seemingly random requests on Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever the case may be. Don't use Facebook for networking, but it's just an example. So I would say being a little bit engaged, or if you're a little bit shy, having a kind of a personal message, sometimes that's easier, or showing that you care about something. So for example, I have a call with another veteran who's leaving the Army tomorrow. He reached out to me and he kind of had a similar background. He mentioned, hey, I'm looking at transitioning. And I was more than happy to help someone like that because he showed a little bit of extra effort and that he cared about something. And then it's going to take time. I kind of had to build from like zero because this is not a product that's really used a lot in the government, LinkedIn and some of the other networking tools. And almost everybody I knew I'd known through armed service. But over time, if you consistently do it and use your peers, MIDS alumni, you'd be surprised at how often that you can search a company you're interested in and someone you know will work there. And then you can reach out to them, get the inside scoop, et cetera, see what positions are open. So let's go, Tango. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right. What are the suggested mindset attitude when talking about a potential opportunity with a recruiter or of internship or interviewer of an on-campus job / projects? So a lot of times the recruiters and the HR people, I found this particularly frustrating, are clearly reading off a checklist. Like, do you have 2 years experience? Are you a computer science or data science major? And they're not a technical person. So you just kind of got to answer the bullets as truthfully and as thoroughly as you can. I wouldn't go particularly deep on like a lot of the machine learning stuff, et cetera, with an HR person, because that's not their field. Their field is to meet candidates who are within this criteria. When you go to an interviewer, so you should have a pretty good idea of who they are before you talk to them. Usually if you get picked for an interview, they'll say it's going to be Nick and John, at Amazon or whatever. You can look those people up and then do a little bit of research about their background, and then pretty quickly paint a picture based upon how long they worked there, where they studied at, etc. And kind of have a good idea of the level technically that you should speak to them about. And if you have let's say it's a biotech company, and you have a project that you did in your class that's related to that field, that'd be one of the first things I bring up. As soon as you can get it associated with a question, you just bring it in, and ideally you've practiced with your peers a little bit, you know their background, so you're speaking on the same wavelength. You're bringing as much in common with them as you can, even though you're only going to have about an hour or two to make an impression during that interview, if that makes sense. Okay.
Hey, Derek, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead, Minda.
Sorry, I missed the first part of your talk. So, but I'm glad to see you here. You know, I was just wondering, you may have spoken to this. Was there an area that you found particularly challenging for you while you were at MIDS, and what did you do to go about like tackling that? How did you overcome it? And then how did you use that as a way to keep moving you forward?
Actually, this is actually related to Shufwan's question. She just posted, so this is actually a really good question. I'm glad you brought that up. So Shufwan said, what did you do to prep for internship / fill in techniques, knowledge gaps during the winter of your first semester? So boot camp was like a hellacious experience for me. So I came, like my previous job was I taught people like basic training. I ran like literally like 200 high school kids would show up, and we'd teach them how to throw hand grenades and put on their uniforms and all that stuff. So I was not prepared. And I realized that self-discipline and taking things that were like, I was never going to take probabilistic machine learning. That was just not, compared to like the guy who worked at IBM for 5 years after getting it, I was not going to make up that skill gap. What I could do was I could learn the basics, and then I could use my industry knowledge. So I targeted a lot of like government work or defense work. And I actually took Nick's class, which was huge, but also a lot of the academic classes on their own are not going to get you there if you're a little bit behind to start. So Udemy was what worked very well for me. So I was doing both the kind of makeup classes and online courses that I could do that helped me. And before you know it, you kind of got the basics down, and then you can apply that. You may not get as sophisticated of an answer, but you can answer a lot of the same things that your peers would. You just have to do a little bit more basic approach. You didn't do the super advanced approach, if that kind of answers the question. And then what I found actually with the gaps during the first semester, I actually found it kind of relaxing in a weird way, because I feel a lot better about problems that if I'm actually working towards solving them. One of the worst things you could do is just sit there and let something kind of ruminate. So I found over the break period, I would sleep in a little bit. For me, I would get up, and then I would do about 2-3 hours every day of something related to MIDS. And I had a plan before I went out. So it wasn't like, I'm just going to look on the internet and try and solve something. It was, I'm doing this course for like 3 hours this morning. And I actually felt way better because I could see improvement. And I knew going back to school, it was going to be that much easier, until I started like the machine learning course. I thought it was going to be that much easier showing up because I had prepared. So I felt a lot better than when I did like starting boot camp, and I was like, oh my God, this is so hard. Do companies hire for internships throughout the year, or do the number of open positions decrease by, say, spring? I think there is going to be more opportunities, if I remember correctly, like February, March, because as they close out their books in the fiscal year, they got a budget for a certain amount of interns and how much they pay them. So they may not have projected that right now. So there is definitely going to be more opportunities at that time period. But that being said, that tends to be when everybody's going for them. And also there are internships, which are basically over the break period. So companies have positions open for both. I would say kind of, you have to unfortunately continue to look. And that's why this is kind of like, you got to treat it as another class in terms of the amount of time, because there's multiple sources they could be posted at, through LinkedIn, through the Career Center, through MIDS alumni. And you just got to kind of keep a pulse on all those things so you can be the first in line when an opportunity does open up. And the more you spread that out, if you don't want to cram it into like a month or 2 long period, it's going to be a lot easier on you too. All right. No problem. I don't see any hands raised. Let me scroll through this. Sorry, I'm looking away for a second here.
Hey, Derek, can you talk a little bit about your interview experience? I know that everyone expects to have to talk about, obviously, the hard skills, the tech skills, but how often were you asked about soft skills?
That's actually a great question, Courtney. Do we teach STAR here?
I don't know. We'll have to, Minda's on. She can
Yeah,
probably.
they just got a handout for STAR in their internship toolkit.
So actually, I got this right here. I'm glad you brought this up. I missed over it. Just let me open an Excel. So I did have kind of a funny story. I did have an interview for AWS, and they have the 14 leadership principles, and this is going to kind of touch on 2 things. So I'll bring over the STAR format, which is situation, task, action, result, for those who are not mid students. And I did it related to their leadership principles. So this is kind of, researching the company beforehand. And I found out the guy I was talking to was, I did a recruiting trip to a university 15 years ago, and he was on the track team and he hosted me. Like, he had taken me around campus and all that stuff. It wasn't at West Point, it was at another school. And he was the guy who did the interview. And I was like, oh, so we definitely have something in common. But this is kind of specifically related to Amazon. Basically, I had a story, situation, task, action, result for each one of their principles. And then this is what I had related to general. And actually, I got the book somewhere back here. Yep, right here. High impact interview questions. So it was, hey, conflict in your organization. When have you had an ethics challenge? Showing it's time you had to lead through a shortcoming. It's kind of examples of the types of questions. And then I just broke them down by domain. And I had an answer like this lined up based upon something, because you don't want to give the standard, like, oh, my weakness is I care too much. Type answer. So I had a personal story kind of aligned up with each one of those. And this goes to practicing early. There's no way, even though these all happened to me, I can remember that STAR format of all those relating to the 14 leadership principles, or each type of question in a short period of time. But if you practice over a long period of time, you're going to gradually remember all of those. And then related to the questions, usually the interview process, the smaller the company, the less rounds you're going to likely have. So for example, with Teledyne Engineering, which is a defense contractor, I had one several hour long presentation where I had to show something I did in class, answer a lot of probability questions, and then they went directly into the behavioral part. So they brought on someone who is going to be a non-technical person to interview for that, who's basically going to be my boss. And with that, they asked a lot of things about working with people or diverse groups or things of that nature. And that's those were a lot of the questions in that case. And you're going to see that being agreeable and being easy to work with, and having having worked through some, whether it's challenging coworkers or being on a project you didn't want to be part of and having a good attitude, all that's life. You're going to deal with that a lot. And when you start a new job, that's no exception. So if I would prioritize those type of questions first, or those type of answers for those type of questions, and then you start to get more into it. So it's usually, and you can kind of tell by who's interviewing you. There's going to be a HR screener, then there's probably going to be a technical interview, and sometimes a technical assessment, and then there's going to be the team mesh. Like, this is who you're going to work with. Like, are you a good personality and work ethic fit type interview after that. That's usually the format it follows, if that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I also like to see the way that you demonstrate how to keep track of the internships and keep track of the jobs. And that's very smart, because it can get overwhelming as you apply to all these jobs and internships, making sure that you keep notes about what you spoke about maybe in the first interview, who to follow up with, little notes that maybe if you were having like a chit chat session, things that you might have in common. So I think that's a great point to bring up as the students are doing internships and jobs, is really keeping track of all that information. So that was great to see.
Yeah, and kind of related to that, it makes you much more likely to convert it into the network. So for example, I had a solar panel guy. I went to one of the Energy Week things. He happened to be from very close to where I was from. And I mentioned Bakersfield, California, when I reached out to him, and I immediately got a response. Like, if I hadn't done that, you're just you're just a number at that point. Unless he can kind of like, oh, this is the guy from Bakersfield, or whatever.
So does anybody else have any other questions for Derek that we have him online? Remember, it can be about anything. It can be about courses, internships, jobs, balancing work, life, whatever you can think of. Feel free to go ahead and put it in the chat for him.
Yeah, and
It's also nice to see a couple more alumni on the call. So I saw Ronald's name and Joe Little and AB. It's nice. Welcome. Glad to have you back.
Okay, it doesn't look like we have any other questions coming in, but of course, everyone knows they can reach out to Derek if you think of a question afterwards, or if you want to connect with him or ask questions about Dell, please do so. I'm glad that you were able to join us, Derek. And if y'all have any questions and want any follow-ups, please reach out to me or Minda or Derek. And if not, we will see you all next Tuesday.
Thanks, Derek.
Thank you so
Good
much, Derek. You were great.
thanks, guys.
It was super.
Kill the screen sharing here.